Hello and welcome to Looking Through Luke, a YouTube series where we systematically work through one of the ancient biographies of Jesus known as the Gospel of Luke. My name is James and I'm so glad that you've found us. Whether you're a skeptic, a curious onlooker, or indeed a follower of Jesus, my hope is that together we would have a clearer view of who Jesus is, the claims that he made and what he did, and that along the way we might even meet Jesus himself. Feel free to ask questions or comment below as we learn together. I'm so glad that you're here, so let's jump into our next episode. So we pick up where we left off last time. Jesus is in the synagogue, he's in the temple. He's opened up the scroll of Isaiah, he's read it, he's sat down, every eye in the room is fastened on him. They're amazed at how he's spoken. And we read that all spoke well of him. They were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth, his eloquence, his learning, he speaks with authority. And then they said, and this is where we finished last time, isn't this Joseph's son? Isn't this Jesus, Joseph's son? Don't we know this guy? And then there's a sense in which there's both admiration for the way in which he speaks, but also just a hint of familiarity. And what's that old expression? Familiarity breeds contempt. There's a sense in which, well, this Jesus guy is a known quantity. So how do we make sense of what we've heard? There's that tension between admiration and, if you will, skepticism. And so as we pick it up today, we pick it up from chapter 4, verse 23. And this is Jesus' response to them. And keep in mind, Luke is taking us through, this is, if you will, the introduction to Jesus' ministry. This is part 2. So we had his testing in the wilderness. We now have his teaching. And part 3, what will follow, we'll get to that next week, is his authority to heal and perform signs and wonders. And that's an interesting point, because listen to what Jesus has to say now. He says in verse 23, "Surely you will quote this proverb to me, 'Physician, heal yourself.' And you will tell me, 'Do here in your hometown what we heard you do in Capernaum.' Truly, I tell you," he continued, "no prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the sky was shut for 3.5 years, and there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath, in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet, yet not one of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian." All the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. They got up, they drove him out of the town, and they took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built in order to throw him off the cliff. But he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. So let's recap. Jesus has opened up the scroll, he's read it, he's sat down, everyone's speaking well of him, they're amazed. That would be a good time to end it, wouldn't it? Cut to the credits, roll the credits, wait till the next episode. But Jesus knows what's on their hearts. And so he says to them, "Surely you'll quote this proverb to me, 'Physician, heal yourself.'" In other words, the crowds, they want a sign, they want proof. They've heard these incredible words come from Jesus' mouth. Effectively, Jesus has said, "With me, there's a new era. There's a new beginning. If you will, there's a new sheriff in town." And so the natural response of the crowd, the natural response of those in the synagogue is to prove it. Prove it, Jesus. Show us. We've heard what you've said. Now back it up. Seems like a pretty natural response, doesn't it? And the thing is, Jesus could have. He could have performed a sign, and it will all have been done and dusted. People would be happy, and in a sense, we could just move on. But he doesn't. And there's an interesting question as to why. In fact, the crowd in Nazareth, They want him to do, and this is his hometown, this is his home playing field. These are the people that knew him best. A lot of rallies would be mixed in with this. They've heard of the things that Jesus has done elsewhere. Jesus himself says that. He says, you'll tell me, do here in your hometown what we heard you do in Capernaum, elsewhere. Well, Jesus, you've done it there. Surely you can do it here. You've said you're somebody. Now prove it. And he could have. So why doesn't he? I want to suggest he doesn't for a couple of reasons. Firstly, he knows people's hearts. He knows the motive that goes along with the request. And actually, Luke brings out something here that will travel through with Jesus his entire ministry. The demand for proof in signs and miracles. And Jesus will consistently come back at that and say, actually, signs and miracles won't be enough to persuade you to believe because of the hardness of your heart. And really, what matters most here is not the signs and miracles that will happen, it's Jesus' message. That's what really matters. The test of a prophet, and Jesus is seen in this, if you will, as a prophet. The test of a prophet is his message, not the signs that he does. In other words, pay attention to what I've said, watch and see, and you'll see enough to be able to make your own mind up. You don't need it now. You can hear and believe without seeing and believing. And Jesus goes on and he gives the people a history lesson, some of their national history, which, as we'll see, they didn't appreciate. He says, I assure you there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time when the sky was shut for 3.5 years and there was severe famine throughout the land. If you don't know the story, this is one of the dark, low points of Israel's history. They've turned their back on God, and God has sent messenger after a messenger to invite them to repent, to invite them to turn their hearts and lives back to God, and they've ignored it. They go their own way. And so God sends a famine into the land. And this, you can read the story for yourself, but Elijah ends up spending time with a widow, a Phoenician widow. And through his miraculous provision, she is provided for throughout the famine. Equally, in the time of Elisha, the prophet that succeeds Elijah, there were many with leprosy, says Jesus, yet not one of them was cleansed. Who was cleansed? Well, Naaman. Naaman was a pagan. Naaman was a Gentile. Naaman was a Syrian. These prophets, Elijah and Elisha, are sent by God into a dark period in Israel's history. And the people of Israel are so closed off to what God is doing that their signs and wonders are actually performed amongst the Gentiles, those that don't belong to God, those who would not expect anything from God. And Jesus draws that analogy and says, if you think about this period in your history and think about those miracles and what they were performed, and now think about me. Firstly, rejecting a messenger from God is risky business. Israel had done it in their past, and they lived with the consequences of having ignored God. And Jesus comes in and says, there's a risk here in my hometown that you're going to ignore, you're going to reject God's messenger, me. Think twice about it, because the consequences will be significant. And people have to decide again about God's messenger here in Jesus. But there's a larger point, I think, that Jesus is making here, which is that those closest to Jesus may miss God's blessing. See, the very people that should have been blessed through Elijah and through Elisha, through their ministry, missed out. And it was the unlikely, the unexpected, the undeserving, the outsiders who were blessed. I think Jesus is offering a warning here that there's a bit of hometown rivalry, a bit of hometown jealousy going on here. You've done these things in Capernaum, you've done these things in other places. What about us? We're your hometown. We're your homeboys. Don't we deserve a bit of extra special treatment? And contrary to that, Jesus says, actually, be careful. Because those closest to me may actually end up missing out on seeing what God's doing. I think that's an interesting thought for us. There are many pious religious people who think they are close to God because they perform the right rituals. And as we will see, and as we will see through Jesus' ministry, and as we see so often in the world today, it's the desperate, the unexpected, the needy, those who don't think they deserve it, who call out to God and experience God's presence and closeness, experience His blessing. And that should be a warning to those who would rest on their own righteousness, their own moral goodness, that somehow God should take care of them because they're upstanding citizens and they do the right thing. And it should give great heart and encouragement to anyone watching this who might be tempted to say, God could never, would never do this for me because of who I am. If you knew who I am, if you knew what I'd done. Well, Jesus, at the beginning of his ministry, says to his homeboys, his relatives, his friends around him, you're in danger of missing out because you think you're deserving. And if you look at Israel's past, when they turned their back on God, it was the undeserving, the unlikely, the outsider and outcast who received God's blessing. So how do the people of Nazareth respond? Well, in verse 28, we read it. They react, but it's not a positive reaction. All the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. Why were they furious? Well, because they knew their history, and they got what I've just explained to you. They understood the implication of what Jesus is saying here. And so we read, they took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built in order to throw him off the cliff. But he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. Jesus' life is threatened. He's in real danger here. And we don't know in the way that Luke's written it whether something miraculous happened here, as if Jesus kind of just whooshed through the crowd, walked through. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed and I think about this, I think about, perhaps a rugby player or a sportsman going through and evading tackles. And I kind of imagine Jesus doing this in slow motion as people are trying to grasp hold of him, and he just kind of shapeshifts or something as he moves around. Maybe it was miraculous. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe Jesus had some help and fought through the crowd and was able to escape. We don't know. What we do know is that his life was threatened. And it will be the first time amongst numerous times where this is the case. And ultimately, he will die. But he doesn't hear because it's not his time, and he hasn't finished what God sent him to do. And for the first time, we see the sign of what the prophet Simeon predicted back in chapter 2 when Joseph and Mary present the baby Jesus at the temple. Remember what Simeon said? He says to Mary, "This child is destined to cause the falling and rising of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be spoken against." And here in the introduction to his ministry, we have the first inkling of what that might look like. That there will be people that rise up against Jesus, that fall on his words and are broken, can't accept who he is and what God's doing. And we're going to see that throughout his ministry. There'll be some who respond. There'll be some whose eyes are open. There'll be some who see Jesus for who he is and see what God's doing. And there'll be those that don't. Jesus will divide as he walks through life. Friends, thanks for joining me. Look forward to next time as we look at part 3 of Luke's introduction to Jesus' ministry. We move from the message, and ironically, given the passage here, we'll then look at the fact that Jesus does perform signs and miracles in different towns. But join me then as we unpack who Jesus is, what he's about, why he came. I hope you're encouraged. If you've got questions, as always, chuck them in the comments below. See ya.
Thanks so much for watching. Feel free to make a comment below. And if you did find the video helpful or interesting, please hit the thumbs up and give us a like, and click the bell notification and subscribe. It really helps us get these videos out to a wider audience. We're not trying to build a massive following or channel. We are simply trying to communicate the truth of who Jesus is from the Bible. So if that's something that you can get behind, we love your support by doing those 2 simple things. It really helps us out. Thank you, and see you next time.